When did you first realise you had a mental illness and how did that come about?
In 1992, I was living in Bateman's Bay, and apparently I'd become quite depressed. And my partner got me to go and see the local GP. From there, they transferred me across to the mental health unit because they were a little concerned with my well-being. Through that process, I was really lucky to get a case manager down there, a guy called Graham Garland, that worked with me and got me to go to the Black Dog Institute. It used to be out at Prince Henry Hospital. They had a process where they actually asked you and your partner 385 questions. And at the end of it, they just suggested that I go back to Bateman's Bay and take the medication that Graham was trying to get me to take. I actually got a diagnosis of bipolar affective disorder at that time. But I'd known for a long time that I had something not quite right. And that went all the way back to 1965 when I tried to join the Navy. And sailed through the reading, writing and arithmetic, and at the end of the day they said, Mr. Holmes, some of the tests that were done here, it's indicated you're going to have a problem and you need to go home and see your GP. And so I tried, when I walked out of there, I sort of tried to get a sense of what was wrong, but it took me all that time until 1992 to actually get someone to tell me that that I actually had bipolar affective disorder.
Do you agree with your current diagnosis?
Yes, I was very pleased to get that diagnosis because what it did for me through understanding where that had come from and from the DSM-4 as it was that time, it actually helped me understand the sorts of things that I'd need to work on if I wanted to not be going back revisiting some of those things that had happened. And while I didn't like the medication that I was on, because and I stayed on it for about 8 years, like for me, after about 3 years with the medication, I was on fairly heavy doses of lithium and a couple of other drugs. For me, it was like walking through molasses. So I was never really happy with that side of it. But I am happy now today that I actually do know some of the external things that have actually caused me to be the human being that I am.
Is there any other condition that makes life difficult for you?
I've got several conditions that I struggle with. One is I'm on medication for prostate, a problem that I prefer not to have, but it's just one of those things apparently in my age that you get. I've got another problem where my right eye, if I close my left eye, my right eye is actually quite blurry. Apparently it comes from what they described as an untreated lazy eye. It's just one of the things that apparently they pick up, in the first 3 or 4 years. All the stuff that was going on at home, that never happened. So I had lots of suggestions around what I can do, and one of them is that it's not going to get better. I also I've learnt through a thing called the hearing voices approach that what I thought was tinnitus was actually a lot of what's referred to as untreated trauma, and I've done a lot of work on that. That it helps me to understand when my mind gets a little bit more active and I start to hear things that other people can't hear. For a long time I wouldn't talk about that, but for now I'm involved with the Hearing Voices Network and quite happy how that's working.
What is the hardest thing about having a mental illness?
I think the hardest thing for me is how disruptive it's been in my life. For a long time, not really understanding what was causing some of the problems that I had, and not really knowing how to address those things. It's destroyed quite a lot of relationships because I wouldn't listen. I've lost contact with my children. I've got a son that's 42 and a daughter that's 38, and had no contact with them for quite a long period of time. And that was things like when I was having that major episode back in 1992, I wasn't around. I got quite depressed. But I think the biggest thing is just the lack of understanding. There is a bit more now, with what's happening with places like Beyond Blue and the Black Dog Institute. But I still think there's not a lot of real understanding around some of the discrimination that goes on.
What has really helped you?
The things that really helped me was, and I need to go back to 1993, and this is some 12 months after I'd actually got my diagnosis. I moved up from Bateman's Bay, where I got my original diagnosis, to Lake Macquarie, and I was sent off to a place called Pelican House, which was a community mental health centre in Lake Macquarie. And having a case manager that actually had the time to listen to what I was wanting to do, she helped me get an appointment with what was then called the CRS, which was the Commonwealth Rehabilitation Service. And that really helped, because the woman that I had there as a case manager, Selena Arnold, normally what happened after 13 weeks, they'd kick you out and they would get someone else in their place. But she made the decision that she was going to work with me until I was actually satisfied that I knew what I wanted to do. And as part of that, she sent me off and done what was called the JVIS, which was the Jackson Vocational Interest Survey. And through that process, I was able to identify a number of things that through that test they thought I'd be good at. There was also a range of things that they identified that I wasn't so good at. And I remember when that information came through, I thought they'd actually got I had the wrong results. Because the sorts of things they were saying I'd be good at was financial advising, education, and advice to government. And they were the furthest things from my mind. But through having that support from the CRS, I was able then to go off and do some training that actually helped move it. The other thing that was really helpful for me in the early stages was medication. And although I've worked out how to actually live without medication, in those early days, it actually helped slow my mind down. The side effects of that is they used to tell us that it wouldn't put weight gain on. Well, I'm living proof that it does change the way the body metabolises stuff. I was 42, I'd never been over 10 stone, and being on lithium, I got up to 16.5 stone. Well, I've lost a couple of stone, but I'll tell you what, it's really hard work trying to lose weight. People tell me there's lots of things out there you can do. I think the other thing that it really helped was in 1996, Hunter Health actually sent 4 of us off to a conference in Brisbane, and I was lucky enough to hear Pat Deegan talk at that conference, and it helped me understand what the bits I needed to work on, and the bits I needed to work on was around self-stigma. Like Pat used two big yellow flowers. That's all she had in a presentation, two big yellow flowers. And she talked about how she felt when she was given a diagnosis, and it took me all the way back to when I walked out of that interview for the Navy back when I was 15 years and 9 months, and how that made me feel. And the second part of that, I heard Charlie Rapp speak about a thing called having a woodshed period after you had a major episode, where you could actually think through what was it you wanted to do with the rest of your life, what was going to give you some purpose, and being allowed to, and he used an image of someone learning how to play a saxophone, and he talked about part of the reason they banish you out into the woodshed was because it can be quite scratchy at times, and so those couple of things really made a difference. And I think the third thing was that I came into the consumer movement at a really interesting time when we actually had the National Mental Health Strategy, and I was lucky enough to see the possibilities of what we're experiencing now. And for me, I went from being on a pension to where I ended up working full-time at St Vincent's Hospital, and I'll be ever grateful for those opportunities.
In your opinion, what causes a mental illness?
What I've discovered around the causes to mental illness, like in our family, there's a genetic component. A number of the males, including my two brothers, have had diagnoses. So that's what I believe, you know. And other people may want to argue about that, but I just know in our family that's where it's come from.
Do you think your childhood or late life experiences were a factor?
Yeah, early childhood, some of the issues around some of the diet we had, also some of the behaviour stuff, like Dad came through the army, served some time up in New Guinea, and he picked up some bad habits along the way, like with drinking and gambling, and there was always a shortage of money, and I know that when Mum left when I was 10, there was definitely a range of issues involved.
How has your illness been treated, and how effective have the treatments been?
Well, for me, for 1992, I think I've had a really luxurious Rolls-Royce ride. I was lucky enough, Graham Garland, who, as I said, was my initial case manager, encouraged me, and I got onto a medication that worked the first time. I can remember saying to Graham, how will I know that this has worked? He said, oh, you just will. And I thought, that's pretty scientific. But what happened after about 8 days of being on this lithium, my thinking actually, it went really quiet. And I often describe it as actually looking out on a lake where there's no wind. And that had been something that I'd been looking for a really long time. I also, like being down in the country, at that time there was no beds down there, so I was actually lucky I was never put into a big institution or into a what they now call mental health units, because I think my journey would have been very different. Because I was quite rebellious, and like I know from working on the wards that a lot of people don't have the time on the wards to give me what I got from Graham.
What do you wish you had known then that you know now?
Well, as I often say, that having the lotto numbers from last Monday night would be really useful. I think some of the information and apps and things that have been developed would have been helpful if I would have had access to them, but I don't really know.
Have you done anything to help others with a mental illness?
Yes, I've learnt, for me, it's important to stay involved, and I've created a number of groups and projects that have apparently helped other people along the way. In 2014, with a group that I'd created at St Vincent's called the Super Group, several of them put off and nominated me for an exceptional contribution award with the Themes Conference. And I'm led to believe through that process that they indicated that I had helped people. But for me, it's more, I do this because it just keeps reminding me of, if I don't do certain things each day, that I could end, I know where I could end up back in, because I had suicidal thoughts back in 1992. And I really struggled with understanding what my purpose in life was.
In your opinion, what is the most important change that needs to happen to improve outcomes for people with mental illness?
Well, I can only talk about New South Wales because that's where I live. And I think the biggest thing that could change in New South Wales is two sections in the Mental Health Act. One is Section 195, which actually allows the medical profession to override what a lot of people believe are their rights. And the other section is Section 84, which, is like, I really laugh every time I read it, and it says the medical superintendent can do whatever he thinks works. And until those two sections, Section 195 and Section 84, are changed, and the practice that goes along with giving the psychiatrist and the medical fraternity, getting them to change the way they work, I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress.
Do you have any final words about mental illness?
Well, I think for me, I'm very grateful that I have gone the journey that I've been in, because with a diagnosis of bipolar affective disorder, 15% of the people that actually get a correct diagnosis after being in the system for nearly 12 years commit suicide. And so I'm really lucky that I'm one of the 85% that have had the opportunity to get some really useful information, to have a worker that actually had the time to spend many hours with me in those early days, and to steer me in a direction that allowed me to have what I call having a second chance at life. I went to from where I was on a disability support pension to where I was working as part of a senior executive team in a hospital.